Welcome to the Link Online. And here we are, coming to you live on Facebook on Fridays at 16:15 hours GMT or 1:15 in the afternoon, as it is for all of us, on the beginning of a holiday weekend for many in Canada. Hi, I'm Carmel Kilkenny, sitting in for Mark Montgomery with Lynn Desjardins.
Hello there.
Levon Savunts.
Hello there.
And there at Social Media Control, Leo Jimenez. And on the controls out there, we have Dominique Baudouin with us today, and overseeing it all in the background there is Pierre Dutil. Now, coming up in this half hour,
I'll look at why Canada's working with other countries to try to stop China's Huawei from dominating the coming G5 wireless technology.
And I'll talk to a trade expert about what the recent trade war truce between the US and EU means for Canada.
And did you know that Canada is the only member of the G7 countries that does not have an estate tax? Well, some say it's time to implement it on the wealthiest families here. We have those stories and some of your comments coming up on this edition of The Link Online. Well, there was more news this week about Chinese tech giant Huawei and concerns about national security among Canada and its allies. Lynn, what's happening?
Well, the Globe and Mail reported that the U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton talked directly about the China-based company with Canadian officials. Seems several countries are worried about Huawei dominating this coming G5 telecommunications technology. And I don't know a lot about this stuff, so to find out more, I contacted Daniel Bader. He's a technology analyst in Toronto.
Huawei is the biggest provider of cellular network equipment in the world, and it's the third largest phone seller in the world. It's present in almost every developed and developing nation across the globe. And it's because of that dominance that Western countries like the US, the UK, Australia, and now Canada are concerned that the company, with its ties to the Communist Party in China, poses a potential security risk by installing backdoor access to its equipment that the Chinese government can then use to gain advantage or information about the people that are using the networks in various countries.
Is there a specific threat for Canada's national security?
At this point, no. The national security threat is a little nebulous, and it comes from a conversation that National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, John Bolton, had with Prime Minister Trudeau back in April, along with other members of the Five Eyes intelligence organization, which includes the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And according to the U.S., and many of its security officials and intelligence community, including former heads of the FBI, CIA, and NSA, Huawei poses a security threat because it is required to listen to and provide information to the Chinese government. All private companies are in China, but because of a history of cyber terrorism and espionage, there is concern that Huawei may be working on behalf of the Communist Party.
Huawei has been active in Canada. Can you give us an idea of in what way?
Yes. So Huawei has invested about $50 million in Canada through a series of research and development centers for next-generation wireless, as well as through the university network. That university network allows Canadian students and professors, researchers to help the company build patents for its portfolio of 5G wireless. But the concerns from the Canadian tech industry are that none of those patents are staying in the country. According to a report written by the Globe and Mail back in May, most of those patents are actually going home to China, where Huawei is using them to develop further dominance in 5G. So there's added incentive here for the Canadian government to intervene and potentially lower Huawei's dominance in the industry.
When the networks shifted from 3G to 4G, it was a fairly quiet transition. Why is there so much importance now being placed on the development of 5G networks? 5G
is going to make connecting to the internet much cheaper. And as a result, more things are going to be connected to the internet. If you've heard of the Internet of Things, it includes not just phones, tablets, watches, but also cars, the ability for real-time applications like remote healthcare. If you think of some of the better innovations that 5G will allow for remote surgeries, that doctors in large urban areas at well-equipped hospitals would be able to actually do surgeries over wireless networks in remote areas. These are things that 5G allows for, and Huawei wants to be at the center of that. It has developed billions of dollars of various products and research, and the Canadian government, even though it is not allowing Huawei to bid on government contracts, is warning that with the proliferation of 5G, Huawei stands to gain more than any other company, and that worries both the U.S. and its allies like Canada and Australia.
Tech analyst Daniel Bader went on to say it's unclear what the Canadian government will or can do because Huawei is already so entrenched in the Canadian information technology ecosystem. It may try to prevent the company from bidding on important contracts like network infrastructure, and he thinks the government will perhaps just talk to the private telecoms to try to discourage them from using Huawei.
Interesting. We have a trade agreement with China, a FIPA, Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreement, and I wonder exactly where this might fall under that. So more interesting times ahead.
Yeah, and we're negotiating another one, an actual free trade agreement.
Yep.
Well, next year in Canada is a federal election year, and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives released a study earlier this week that suggests it's time for an estate tax. David McDonald, an economist with the CCPA, says an inheritance tax on estates above $5 million, for example, could raise $2 billion for new government programs. In the report, McDonald looked at Canada's 1%, the wealthiest 87 families, and he told me about some of the recent developments.
Well, what's interesting is that looking at these wealthiest 87 families, the amounts of wealth that they have is staggering. The family's average is $3 billion. That's billion with a B, which is 4,000 times more than the average Canadian. These 87 families have the same wealth as 12 million Canadians, actually have the same wealth as the combined net worth of everything in PEI, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland, so 3 of the Atlantic provinces. That's all the houses, cottages, cars, boats, savings accounts, and so on. So it's a tremendous concentration of wealth in very few hands. And inheritance has become a more important part of driving that wealth at the very top. So in 1999, just under half of the wealthiest 87 families got on the list because of inheritance. But today, it's just over half. And so we're seeing inheritance being the primary route by which these wealthy 87 families get on that list, in essence creating dynastic families, generational family wealth that's passed down generation to generation and compounds over time, it appears.
Yeah, well, it's that compounding that's really interesting because, meanwhile, their wealth is increasing exponentially while the middle class, the so-called middle class, which varies across the country, is really not getting ahead at all.
And over the past 4 years, we've seen the growth in the average for the wealthy 87 grow at 40%. So 40% growth over the last 4 years, a stunning increase of $800 million per household on average. Whereas for the middle class in Canada, it's increased about 14%. So much lower percentage growth. But because the middle class doesn't have nearly as much money, it's worth about $40,000 in increased wealth from about $260,000 to $300,000 on average. And so we're seeing much higher growth in the wealth at the high end. And there are reasons for that. I mean, there's a tax preference for the type of income that you get from wealth versus the type of income that most Canadians get, which is by working. The types of incomes you get from wealth are things like capital gains or dividends, and there's substantial tax discounts on those types of income in contrast to employment wealth where you pay the regular rate. The other thing that's worth pointing out, it's not purely that the the income that you gain from wealth is taxed at a lower rate, which it is. But there's also an interesting overlap between the wealthiest families and the list of the top paid CEOs. There's a big overlap between the two, so it's not at all uncommon to find the top paid CEOs who get these exorbitant pay packages with insane incentive pay in the tens of $20 million range. Also are members of these wealthiest families. So these wealthiest families, either because they're the founder of the company or they're the child of the founder of the company, end up being among the top paid CEOs, which is another way that wealth perpetuates itself, is that you can not only be extremely wealthy, but get paid extremely well at the company that's making you extremely wealthy.
That was David MacDonald of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives explaining why he thinks it's time Canada implemented an inheritance tax. So what do you think? Drop us a line and let us know. We're going to get some of your feedback and responses coming up in a moment. Well, these are some of your letters and responses to recent stories and blogs we've posted in response to the story of fat shaming by medical staff decried by a dying woman. We received opposing views. First from Nita.
We are all created uniquely with some bigger bone structures and some with smaller bone structures, thus carry weight differently. As long as we are healthy, and therefore we must not buy into the Hollywood type of beauty. Please don't agree with these horrible promoters to skinny is beauty. Unless we see ourselves as beautiful as the Lord made us, we will be punished and intimidated by the very sick people who want to walk around like a skin and bones. Say no to unhealthy weight control.
And then Kevin D. wrote this.
Obese people fill our hospitals. Diet is a huge factor, and we pay for it. This fat person will get no sympathy from most.
Peter Ashcroft responded to several stories this week, but the one in particular that caught my eye was the story, of course, of Canada, very alarmed by arrest of Raif Badawi's sister in Saudi Arabia.
Truth and protest is something that the dictatorial Saudi rulers cannot accept. Where is equality?
And then on the story of scientists formerly unmuzzled by new government policy, Ken Wiebe had this to say.
I'm wondering if this new policy has sufficient safeguards in it to protect people against government research that contains defamatory libel. That was a problem with the old system that the Conservatives addressed by sharply limiting what their scientists could publish. It didn't help that the BC Supreme Court ruled the government was allowed to publish defamatory libel because such research is ideologically motivated comment or opinion, and therefore allowed a fair comment defense. So, does the new policy have provision to deal with scientists who use the system to settle scores by publishing libel? See BC Supreme Court regarding school success by gender, published by Status of Women Canada.
And Ursula Wagner gets the last word today in response to the news that the apparent EU-US trade war truce is positive news for Canada, which of course leads into your story, Levon. Yeah. According to the experts, well, Ursula wrote,
Canada is in a very fortunate position of having a trade agreement with both the European Union and the United States, and that's a great place to be. And she's quoting Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland. And she says, I guess she's talking about CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. I really don't want to be nasty, but only when Italy, in the end, agrees what at present they deny. And she's referring to the fact that several European Union countries have still not ratified this agreement, even though it has entered into force provisionally as of September 21st of last year. So 98% of tariffs between Canada and the EU have gone completely down zero. But until all of the European Union countries ratify it, the rest of the agreement, the rest of the 2% will not come into force.
And it has to be unanimous, right?
Yes.
It sounds like there's so much work for lawyers there.
Lawyers and arm twisting, I guess, by Canada. I mean, you know, we saw what happened with Belgium. Belgium, because of its the way it was designed. The Wallon region in Belgium was very concerned about certain provisions of CETA.
We all learned about the Walloons.
Yes.
Yes.
So now we're learning about some of the concerns that Italy has.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for responding, and of course we invite you to, dialogue with us, and we would love to hear more from you. We're going to get into this story because, of course, last week there was finally some good news in the trade war between the United States and its closest allies. Of course, that was last week. I mean, what's happening this week in China and the U.S., it's all amazing. But U.S. President Donald Trump, of course, hosted European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, and they agreed on a ceasefire in their tit-for-tat tariff war. Levon, you talked to some people who, of course, say this is also good news for us. How so?
Yeah, the general consensus seems to be that whenever Trump stops talking about tariffs, ripping up old trade agreements, that's generally a good thing. It just shows how far we have fallen, that, him just stopping this kind of rhetoric is already considered a good news. There was also the fact that, of course, Mr. Juncker and President Trump agreed to work towards zero barriers between the EU and US, non-trade barriers, and, of course, the European Union agreed to buy lots of US soybeans and some liquefied natural gas. And this comes after, of course, Trump blasted Germany for allowing the Russians to build the Nord Stream pipeline under the Baltic Sea to pump more natural gas to Europe. So this is kind of an olive branch that the European Union extended to the US, and Trump seems to be very, very happy. But there was also some concern in Canada that this might have actually undermined the Canadian and Mexican position, because some analysts worried that, before, because the European Union is such a huge market, that when European Union, Canada, and Mexico stood on one side and the U.S. stood on the other side, it kind of evened the odds a bit. But I talked to several experts, and they say they're not concerned about that. And one of the people I talked to is James Moore. He's a former Conservative cabinet minister. Former Minister of Industry. But he's also on an advisory council that was set up by the current Liberal government to kind of advise them on this ongoing NAFTA negotiations. And NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, U.S., and Mexico. And it
seems to be a memory now.
Well, yeah, and we've been negotiating it over a year now, and we're close, but not close. We don't know.
Depends who you talk to.
And of course, I asked Mr. Moore that very question. I said, aren't you worried that this kind of undermines our position? And he said, no, he's not worried that, in fact, you cannot really compare how close Canada and Mexico have become to the U.S. economy because of NAFTA.
I don't think you can compare the two relationships, meaning Europe and the North American relationship. Certainly our proximity to the United States, the 24-year history of NAFTA, the integrated supply chains, the commercial relationships, the consumer relationships that exist in the North American footprint are well established now, more than a generation deep. And the relationship with Europe certainly is much newer in terms of building those supply chains and commercial relationships. So I don't know that you can really read from one into the other. But also, the Europe-America relationship in terms of getting an actual substantive trade arrangement, as we've seen from the Canadian experience of the past few years, is a protracted, complicated process, as we've seen. So I still think they're very much in the opening stages of what is a very complicated process to arriving at true market access in a bilateral way. The Canada-U.S.-Mexico relationship, as I said, is deep. It's a generation deep under NAFTA, and we have an existing trade relationship we have an existing agreement. We're undergoing renegotiations or amendments to the status quo, and it's a much more mature relationship. And so I don't think the two can really be compared on an apples-to-apples basis.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with James Moore. He's a former Conservative cabinet minister and former industry minister and former Canadian heritage minister. He's also a member of this advisory council that the Liberal government has set up to help them with advice and, brain power.
It's kind of interesting to hear his calm take on things, and of course the understatement of the day, a complicated process. But, I guess what we're watching is Trump, the wheeler dealer, playing everybody off one another.
And you know what? I think we're not giving enough credit to Trump because it seems to be working. Look, he's already got. Yes, they're very, very long way off from actually concluding some kind of a free trade agreement with the European Union, the same one that Canada has.
But, I think the thing is what we're beginning to come to terms with is the era of so-called free trade as we knew it is really over. It is no longer free trade. It's targeted trade. It's manipulated trade, whatever. Just the mention of the auto tariffs sends everybody into
absolutely
terrors. And apparently there was a story that Toyota Canada was considering moving until the talk of the auto tariffs. So, their nice, comfortable relationship with cars going in and out of the United States, not nearly as in the spotlight as the cars coming in and out from Mexico. So, again, as you say, what's going on is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's all relative on some level.
It was very interesting to talk to Mr. Moore because he's a conservative politician, and even he was saying that it's very important to rebalance trade to make sure that ordinary people feel the benefits, that it's not just the big corporations that are reaping the benefits of these trade deals, that ordinary Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans and Europeans understand that they're getting something out of it too. And coming
if the car manufacturers leave Canada, the country's in big trouble.
Yes, but he doesn't think that will happen. I think the experts I've talked to, they see this as a big bargaining chip because the system in the North America is now so integrated that the Trump administration will be shooting itself in the foot if they do that. What people tell me is that Canadians and Mexicans have to also realize that there is tremendous internal opposition to Trump's policies within the United States, that all that auto industry, which has been, benefiting from the lower wages in Mexico, lower Canadian dollar, and research money that goes into they're up in arms, lobbying like hell to see that this auto tariffs. It might happen. Trump has proven that he can be very unpredictable, and he
another understatement.
But it's becoming it's kind of becoming predictable.
No, it isn't, because it's off in every direction.
If you look at what Trump has done, he's basically he's methodically doing what he had said during the
election campaign.
Campaign. Things that we had dismissed, that this will never happen, this is just impossible in politics. He's shown no, he can do that. So I think there is a realization among the political elites elsewhere that in Trump's case, it's not just political bombast. He's not just saying to make an effect. He's actually thinking in that direction.
But
and that makes him now more predictable. Because
the other side of it, too, is the fact that the media coverage, like these trade agreements that evolved over the last 20 years, are very complicated stories and very hard to tell, and people are not that interested until now it's become spotlight issues and they realize how it affects them. So, things have been going on, we've covered several of them, but they sort of come and they go. They're signed, and we don't understand the impact. He's basically putting a spotlight on all of it in terms of rebalancing, to, like, as you say, to make the benefits of globalization a little more widespread. But very interesting times. We're going to leave Trump for a while and give everybody a break. We know all the other media is certainly taking care of it, and we're going to look at some of our blogs this week. Lynn.
I looked at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights making changes.
Yes.
And they basically dimmed the lights on the picture of Myanmar's leader Aung San Suu Kyi. And that, of course, was all about the controversy surrounding her failure to condemn the atrocities that were committed against the Rohingya people. There is a broad community. It's not that big, but there is a community in Canada, and they had put a lot of pressure on the museum to do something. So the museum dimmed the lights, and they put a plaque in front trying to explain why they have done it. And in addition, they have this timeline with 100 of the most important people in terms of human rights. And they haven't done it yet, but they want to take Aung San Suu Kyi's picture right out of there.
She's an honorary Canadian citizen.
Well, that's
Where's
the thing.
that at?
There's nothing the museum can do about the fact that she's an honorary citizen. So that's why they didn't remove her picture, because this was photographs of 5 honorary Canadian citizens.
Nelson Mandela.
Yes, she was in good company, and they couldn't remove her.
Aga Khan, yes.
Yeah.
And the Pakistani girl,
Malala
Yousafzai.
Yeah.
And for 20 points, the last one, I don't know, I don't remember.
We'll find out.
Put everybody on the spot. Anyway, so they weren't going
The
to...
Dalai Lama, yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's right.
That's right. So they weren't going to remove her picture because they can't change her citizenship, but they did that symbolic dimming of the lights. And they're planning to have several other activities, in the coming year and over the summer that they're going to create in discussions with the Rohingya community to explain the situation and explain why they're doing it.
And of course, that's at the museum in the middle
Winnipeg.
of the country. Yes,
Yes,
in Winnipeg.
right, smack in the middle.
Well, speaking of museums, my little favorite story here is, of course, the Dion Quintuplet Museum opening now. The new museum on the shore of Lake Nipissing, Mighty Lake in Ontario. The city of North Bay is right there. The babies were born 84 years ago in Corbeil, Ontario, and of course recognized as a miracle, the first time 5 identical babies ever survived. And the 2 surviving quints, Annette and Cecile, are going for the opening. It's the log house that they were born in, and I have a personal connection because we visited it. We had cousins that lived in North Bay, and we drove by that little log house every time we went. And one time we actually stopped and went in and saw there was like little baskets, and that's where they were put into to keep them warm and put in the oven. Incredible, but the sad story after that, where they were made wards of the state. So that's opening on Sunday, and the 2 surviving quints are going to be there, and they want to be photographed with lots of local children and to bring attention to the exploitation of children. And, the museum will stand as a testimony to everything that can be done to stop that. Levon,
we didn't agree on this, but another museum story, and this is the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, having problems with Facebook because Facebook kept blocking its ads for a Pablo Picasso exhibit because it had some Cubist nudes. And so a very interesting story on how, Facebook in its quest to be, morally acceptable in many countries has completely banned any notion of nudity on its, and it has an algorithm. So
the limitation of artificial intelligence.
So they actually had to go and connect to a real person who finally approved the ads. The ads are running.
Real people in
real
cyberspace.
People, exactly.
Okay, we've got to go now, everybody. Have a great, wonderful weekend. Everybody celebrating. Bye-bye.
With Facebook. because Facebook kept blocking its ads for a Pablo Picasso exhibit because it had some Cubist nudes. And so a very interesting story on how, Facebook in its quest to be, morally acceptable in many countries has completely